On a warm and sunny afternoon, the royal palace was bustling with visitors. People from all walks of life gathered outside the grand building, excited to catch a glimpse of the majestic surroundings. The palace, with its towering walls, beautiful gardens, and intricate architecture, was a place that many dreamed of visiting. Among the crowd was a royal guard, standing tall and proud at his post, his uniform crisp and immaculate. His job was simple but important: to ensure that everything went smoothly, to keep the peace, and to be ever vigilant. The guard had been stationed there for hours, his eyes scanning the crowd, his posture straight, his mind focused. It wasn't an easy job. He had to remain perfectly still and alert, not allowing his attention to wander, no matter how much time passed. The visitors came and went, some taking pictures, others admiring the palace's beauty. But the guard remained unmoving, a symbol of discipline and duty. He had been through extensive training to be prepared for anything that could happen, and he was proud to serve the royal family in this way. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the crowd grew more lively. Children ran past, their laughter echoing through the courtyard, while adults chatted and pointed at the impressive artwork on the palace walls. Amidst the cheerful noise, the guard noticed a young girl standing by herself near the steps leading to the entrance. She looked out of place, her eyes red from crying, her small body trembling slightly. The guard's instincts kicked in. His first thought was to make sure the girl was okay. It wasn't uncommon for children to get separated from their families in such a large crowd, and the guard knew how important it was to keep everything in order. He couldn't let anything disrupt the peace of the palace. He took a step toward the girl, his boots clicking on the stone ground as he approached her. When he reached her, he immediately noticed how scared and upset she seemed. She wasn't calling for anyone, but her eyes were wide with fear, and her lips quivered as she wiped her face with the back of her hand. The guard hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to handle the situation. He had never been trained to comfort crying children, only to keep watch and protect the palace. He knew he needed to do something, but his thoughts raced as he struggled to figure out the best course of action. He thought that maybe the girl was trying to cause a scene, or perhaps she was looking for attention. His training told him that, at times, it was necessary to be firm in such situations. Without thinking much further, he made a quick decision. He stepped forward with a quick motion, and, in an attempt to guide her away from the steps, he used a sharp gesture, his foot striking the ground near her, hoping to startle her enough to get her to move. But as soon as his foot made contact with the stone, a chill ran through him. He had acted too quickly, without understanding the full situation. He watched as the girl flinched and took a step back, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. He could see that she was even more upset now, but he didn't know how to make it right. In that moment, all he could do was stand there, feeling an unease settle deep inside him. He had never meant to cause harm, but his actions had done the opposite. As the crowd continued to move around them, the guard realized that he may have made a mistake. Something about the situation didn't feel right, and he began to feel a sense of regret. The girl was still crying softly, her small shoulders shaking, and he knew he had to find a way to make it up to her. But at that moment, he had no idea just how deep the situation went, and what he would soon discover. As the guard stood frozen, watching the girl retreat from him, he felt a sense of regret slowly creeping in. His swift, sharp motion had been a reflex, one trained into him through countless hours of discipline. But now, seeing the frightened look in the girl's eyes, he realized that his actions had been rushed and hasty. She didn't deserve this kind of treatment. The crowd around them seemed to carry on with their daily activities, but the guard couldn't shake off the image of the girl's terrified face. He glanced around, hoping to spot someone who might help the girl. But everyone was either too caught up in their own conversations or too busy admiring the palace to notice the small scene unfolding near the entrance. The guard took a step toward the girl, intending to apologize or offer some kind of comfort. However, before he could move closer, a concerned onlooker, an older woman with kind eyes, approached the girl. She knelt down to the girl's level, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder and speaking softly to her. The girl, still trembling, seemed to calm down a little at the woman's words. The guard watched silently, standing at a distance, realizing that his own efforts to approach the girl had made things worse. The woman seemed to understand what the girl needed far better than he had. The girl nodded slowly as the older woman spoke to her, offering her some reassurance and even handing her a small cloth to wipe her tears away. The guard took a deep breath, frustrated at how he had handled the situation, but he couldn't ignore the truth. He had acted too quickly, too harshly. His heart sank as he thought of how he had failed to read the situation properly. Feeling uncomfortable, he turned his attention away from the girl and focused on the task at hand, keeping the palace grounds in order. But he couldn't help stealing glances toward the girl, who was now being comforted by the kind stranger. It was a strange feeling, one that left him unsettled. His role was to protect, to maintain peace and order, but in this moment, he felt like he had failed. Minutes passed before the woman and the girl stood up. The woman gave the guard a quick, almost disapproving glance before leading the girl away. The guard stood silently, feeling a deep sense of guilt wash over him. His hands tightened around his rifle, his mind racing as he replayed the events in his head. He had misjudged the girl's emotions. She hadn't been causing trouble. She had been in distress. He had failed to understand that sometimes kindness and patience were the best tools for protecting those in need. But the situation was far from over. Though the girl and the woman were leaving, the guard had no idea what he had just set in motion. What seemed like a simple mistake, a moment of poor judgment, would soon lead him into a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about his job and the world he lived in. As the crowd began to thin out and the palace started to quiet down for the evening, the guard couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. He had crossed paths with someone who held a secret he couldn't yet understand. The girl's tears were not just the result of a lost moment. They were a sign of something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. And the guard was about to find out just how far-reaching his mistake had been. The next day, the royal guard was called to the palace office, a place where the higher-ups made important decisions. As he stood outside the heavy wooden door, he felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. His mind kept going back to the girl, the way her eyes had widened with fear when he had approached her, the way her body had flinched when his foot had hit the ground near her. Had his actions caused more harm than he realized? When the door finally opened, the guard was ushered inside by a stern-looking officer who barely acknowledged him. The officer, with his neatly pressed uniform and serious expression, motioned for the guard to take a seat. The room was silent for a moment, the air thick with tension. The guard sat down, trying to appear calm, though his heart was racing. A few other officials were seated at a long wooden table, all staring at him. He recognized some of them from his earlier training, but there was one person he didn't recognize. A woman, dressed in elegant but simple attire, sat at the head of the table. She looked about the same age as the guard, but her calm, composed demeanor suggested a wisdom that came from years of experience. She observed him closely, her sharp eyes scanning him like a book. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers spoke. "We've received a report about your interaction with a young girl yesterday," he said, his voice even but firm. "Can you explain what happened?" The guard felt his throat tighten, the weight of the question sinking in. He had hoped the situation would be forgotten, but now, it seemed like everything he had done was under scrutiny. He explained what he had seen, a crying girl, clearly distressed, and how he had approached her with the intention of helping. But then he paused, realizing that the moment he had acted in haste had made the situation worse. He told them how the girl had appeared more frightened after he had made the sudden gesture, and how another woman had stepped in to comfort her. The room was silent for a moment as the officials processed his words. The woman at the head of the table finally spoke, her voice gentle but serious. "The girl you encountered," she began, was not just any visitor. She is from a very important family, one with a connection to the royal court. Her presence at the palace was not by chance. The guard's eyes widened as he tried to process what he was hearing. The girl wasn't just any visitor. The woman continued, explaining that the young girl was part of a family who had been involved in a sensitive matter, a matter that required her to remain out of the public eye. Her appearance at the palace was part of a plan to keep her safe, a plan that had clearly been disrupted by his actions. The guard's heart sank. He had no idea that the girl he had approached so carelessly was tied to such an important family. "We understand that your intentions were not malicious," the officer said, breaking the silence. "But we need to make it clear that her safety is of utmost importance. You must be more careful in the future. There are things happening in the palace that you are not aware of. This is not just about guarding the gates, but protecting the people in ways you might not understand." The guard sat there, overwhelmed by the weight of the revelation. He had no idea how deeply his mistake had affected the situation. The girl wasn't just a lost child. She was part of a much bigger story, one that had been carefully kept secret for her protection. And now, his actions had brought attention to something that needed to stay hidden. As he sat in the room, listening to the officials discuss the steps that would be taken next, he couldn't help but wonder just how much more he didn't know about the royal palace and the secrets it held. The royal guard left the meeting feeling a mixture of confusion and unease. The weight of what he had just learned about the girl and her connection to an important family hung heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something far bigger than he had realized. He had only intended to do his duty, guarding the palace and ensuring the safety of the visitors. But now, everything had changed. The young girl was no ordinary visitor. She was tied to something far more significant. As he made his way back to his post, the guard's thoughts raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the consequences of his actions. What if he had hurt her in ways he couldn't understand? What if his careless approach had exposed her to danger? The guilt gnawed at him, and he found himself replaying the moment over and over again in his head. He had acted impulsively, and now he had to live with the consequences. Later that day, the guard was told that he would be reassigned to a different post for the time being. It was a strange feeling, being pulled away from his usual duties. He had always been proud of his role in protecting the royal family, but now, with the knowledge of the young girl's identity weighing on him, he felt like he was no longer in control of the situation. He was now just a small part of a much larger picture. It was only when he arrived at his new post that he began to realize just how much he didn't know. The palace, with all its grand halls and quiet corridors, was filled with secrets, things that even the guards were not privy to. His reassignment seemed to be part of a larger plan, a plan that he wasn't fully aware of. The officials had spoken of protecting the girl and the importance of keeping her safe, but what did that truly mean? What had he gotten himself involved in? Days passed, and the guard spent most of his time at the new post, keeping a low profile and trying to follow orders. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that his every move was being scrutinized. His role had shifted, and he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. But one thing was certain: he couldn't forget about the girl. He couldn't forget the fear in her eyes when he had approached her, or the way she had shrunk back at his movement. The girl's presence had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Then one afternoon, he was called to meet with the woman from the meeting, a woman who seemed to know far more than she had let on. She was standing in a quiet corridor, her expression unreadable as she waited for him. The guard felt a sense of tension in the air as he approached her, unsure of what this meeting would bring. She motioned for him to follow her, and he did so without question. The woman led him through the winding halls of the palace, taking him to a small private room. It was a place the guard had never seen before, hidden away from the public eye. Inside, there were maps and documents spread out on a large table, and the air felt heavy with secrets. The woman turned to him, her eyes serious as she spoke. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "You were involved in something yesterday. something that you don't fully understand yet. But now, we need your help." The guard stood there, stunned. He had no idea what she was referring to, but it was clear that whatever had happened was far from over. The woman's words sent a chill through him. This wasn't just about a mistake he had made. It was about something much larger, something that could affect the entire palace, and perhaps even the kingdom itself. As the woman spoke, the guard began to realize that he was now part of something he hadn't even known existed. His actions, though they seemed insignificant at the time, had set off a chain of events that were now leading him down a path he couldn't turn back from. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he was about to uncover a world of secrets and truths he had never imagined. The girl was just the beginning. The woman's words echoed in the guard's mind long after their conversation ended. He couldn't stop thinking about the direction his life had suddenly taken. He had always believed that his job was simple: stand guard, keep the palace safe, and follow orders. But now he realized there were layers to the palace and its operations that he had never even imagined. The girl, whom he had seen crying and scared, was at the center of it all, and he had no idea just how significant she really was. The woman, who had introduced herself as Lady Ilara, was part of a royal family that had been connected to the palace for generations. She had a calm but commanding presence, and the guard could see that she was someone who had spent years navigating the intricacies of palace politics. She had told him that the girl he had encountered was no ordinary royal relative. Her family had been caught up in a web of intrigue and danger, and her presence at the palace had been carefully planned to keep her safe from harm. The guard learned that the girl's family had been involved in a secretive and powerful faction within the kingdom, one that was at odds with other influential groups. There were threats from all sides, and it was a constant struggle to keep everyone in the family protected. Lady Ilara explained that the girl had been placed at the palace for her safety, but only a few people were aware of her true identity. Most of the palace staff had been kept in the dark about her family's background, including the guards. As the guard listened to her, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The girl hadn't just been lost in the crowd. She had been in hiding, trying to make her way to a secure location within the palace. Her distress had been real, but it had been caused by fear, not by being lost. Her family's enemies were closing in, and the girl had somehow found herself in the middle of it. The guard had unwittingly become involved in a much larger and far more dangerous situation than he could have ever imagined. But what struck him the most was Lady Ilara's next revelation. The girl wasn't just an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos. She was someone of great importance, someone who held the key to securing the future of her family, and perhaps the kingdom itself. There were powerful forces at play, and the girl's safety was paramount to ensuring the stability of the realm. Lady Ilara told him that the girl's family had been working on a plan to change the course of history. It was a plan that involved not just the palace, but the future of the entire kingdom. And with the guard's actions, he had unknowingly jeopardized everything. His mistake had made the situation more dangerous, and now it was up to him to make things right. The guard felt a sense of shock and disbelief. He had never thought that his role in the palace would have such far-reaching consequences. His simple duty to keep order had now thrust him into a world of power struggles, secrets, and political maneuvering. The weight of his actions was heavier than ever before, and he knew that there was no turning back. The next few days were filled with tension. The guard was given new instructions and was told to be extra vigilant. But this time, it wasn't just about keeping the palace safe. It was about protecting the girl and the secret she carried. He was no longer just a guard. He was part of something far bigger than himself. The responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders was immense, and he had no choice but to rise to the challenge. He kept his distance from the girl, knowing that she was still being watched by others, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of protectiveness towards her. He remembered her scared face, her trembling body, and the trust she had placed in the woman who had comforted her. The guard had made a mistake, but he was determined to make it right. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he had a part to play in whatever was coming next. The palace, once a place of routine and order, had become a place of uncertainty. And for the guard, the path ahead was filled with mystery, danger, and the promise of a new understanding of the world he had sworn to protect. The girl's presence had set off a chain of events that no one, not even the guard, could have predicted. And as the days passed, he found himself drawn deeper into a story that would change everything he had ever known. The royal guard's life had been turned upside down. What had started as a normal day at his post had now become a whirlwind of confusion, responsibility, and danger. Every moment, he was reminded of the grave mistake he had made. His mission was no longer simply to stand guard, but to protect the girl and the secrets that surrounded her, secrets he didn't fully understand. As the days passed, the pressure grew heavier. Lady Ilara had told him that the girl was crucial to the survival of her family's legacy. The kingdom's political landscape was shifting, and those who held power were becoming desperate. There were rival factions, each trying to manipulate the royal court for their own gain. The girl was a symbol of hope, a beacon for a group of influential families who believed in a better future for the kingdom. But if her enemies got to her first, it could change everything, not just for the royal family, but for the entire realm. The guard found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, aware that someone was always watching. He had once been able to trust the palace halls, walking them with ease. But now, every corridor seemed filled with uncertainty. His every step felt measured, calculated, and he was no longer sure who he could trust. Lady Ilara had been clear. There were spies everywhere, and not everyone in the palace was loyal to the crown. It was a game of power, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. One evening, as the guard walked through the palace gardens, trying to clear his mind, he caught sight of the girl again. She was standing near the fountain, her back to him. Her once tear-streaked face had become calm, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. She didn't look like the frightened child he had first seen, but rather someone much older, someone who had already seen too much for her years. For a brief moment, the guard thought about approaching her, offering words of comfort, but he knew that he couldn't. His presence could endanger her further. Instead, he stood in the shadows, observing her from a distance. She seemed to be lost in thought, unaware of his gaze. It was clear that she carried a heavy burden, one that he could never fully understand. The guard's role was not to question her, but to protect her. It wasn't about providing comfort. It was about ensuring her safety, no matter the cost. As he turned to leave, a soft voice broke the silence. "You're the guard, aren't you?" The girl's words were quiet but sharp, as if she had been waiting for him to notice her all along. The guard stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. "Yes," he replied cautiously, unsure of what to say next. The girl smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know who you are, and I know what you've done." The guard's breath caught in his throat. The girl knew. How was that possible? He hadn't shared his mistake with anyone, and he certainly hadn't intended for her to find out. He struggled to find the right words, but before he could respond, the girl continued. "I'm not angry with you," she said softly. "I know you didn't mean it, but you have to understand, everything is much bigger than you think. You can't protect me the way you think you can." The guard was stunned. How could she know so much? How could she understand the complexities of the situation better than he did? He had been trained to protect, to observe, and to act without hesitation. Yet, here was this young girl, who had lived through things he couldn't even begin to imagine, telling him that he was just a small part of a much larger puzzle. Before he could speak, she turned away, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not the only one who's been watching. Be careful." With that, she walked off into the distance, leaving the guard standing there, confused and shaken. Her words lingered in his mind long after she had disappeared into the shadows of the palace. He had always believed that he was the one in control, the one who had the power to protect. But now, he wasn't so sure. The girl was more than just a royal relative in need of protection. She was part of something far bigger, something that had been set into motion long before he had ever crossed her path. The kingdom was on the brink of change, and the guard was just one player in a game that he barely understood. He had been thrust into a world of power and danger, and he didn't know how to navigate it. One thing was certain, though. The girl's warning had changed everything. The stakes had been raised. Now, the guard wasn't just protecting her from external threats. He was protecting her from something within the palace itself. Someone close to the royal family, someone with influence, had their own agenda. And the guard knew that he had to uncover the truth before it was too late. The guard couldn't shake the girl's words from his mind. They echoed in his thoughts long after their conversation, leaving him restless and confused. "You're not the only one who's been watching. Be careful." Those words felt like a warning, but a warning from whom? Who else was keeping an eye on the girl? And more importantly, why? He tried to focus on his duties, but the weight of the mystery was always with him. It seemed that every corner of the palace held secrets he wasn't meant to know, and each day, the pieces of the puzzle grew more tangled. He knew that his position as a royal guard meant he was supposed to maintain order and protect the palace. But now, it felt like he was just a small part of something far bigger. The girl's family, her hidden importance, the power struggles within the kingdom. All of it was far beyond what he had ever imagined. In the days that followed, the guard kept a closer watch on the palace, trying to pick up on anything unusual. He found himself becoming more alert, noticing small details he had once overlooked. The palace seemed to be a place of calm on the surface, but beneath that, there was a quiet tension in the air. He couldn't place it, but something felt off. There were whispers in the hallways, and guards exchanged nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. The peaceful facade was starting to crack. Lady Ilara had told him to be cautious, but the guard wasn't sure where to start. He had no idea who he could trust. He had been trained to follow orders and keep a steady eye on the gates, but now there was so much more at stake. The girl was a key player in a game of power he had never known existed. She had warned him that he wasn't the only one watching her, but that didn't explain who the other players were. One evening, while on his shift, the guard noticed something strange. He had been stationed near a part of the palace he rarely visited, an older wing that was usually kept locked. The door, however, was slightly ajar. His curiosity got the better of him, and he approached cautiously, making sure no one was around. As he pushed the door open just enough to peer inside, he noticed something unsettling. There was a figure in the shadows, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The guard's instincts kicked in. He stepped forward silently, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. But before he could move closer, the figure turned toward him. The dim light revealed the face of a man he recognized, an older officer in the royal guard, someone who had always seemed trustworthy. But now, there was something different about him. His expression was cold, his eyes distant, as if he were lost in thought. The guard froze, unsure of what to do. The officer seemed to notice the guard standing there. For a moment, there was silence, and then the officer gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to send a chill down the guard's spine. Something about the officer's presence in this hidden part of the palace didn't sit right with him. He knew that part of the palace was rarely used, and it was unlikely that the officer had a reason to be there. Without saying a word, the officer turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the guard standing there, his heart racing. What had he just witnessed? The man's strange behavior, the location, it all pointed to something secretive. The guard knew then that his suspicions were correct. There were forces at work within the palace, and not all of them were loyal to the crown. The guard didn't know what to do next. His training had taught him how to deal with intruders, how to maintain order. But this was different. The officer's behavior suggested something deeper, something far more dangerous than a simple breach of palace security. The guard needed answers, but he also knew he had to be careful. He couldn't risk drawing attention to himself, not when the stakes were so high. For the first time since he had been assigned to the palace, the guard felt truly out of his depth. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle any situation, but now he was surrounded by forces he couldn't control. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to uncover the truth without putting the girl in danger or revealing his own suspicions to the wrong people. One thing was clear: the palace was full of secrets, and the guard was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that his quest for answers might lead him into a dangerous game, one where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. And with every passing day, the danger grew closer, wrapping around him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The guard's life had become a blur of uncertainty and tension. Every step he took, every decision he made, seemed to pull him deeper into a mystery that he wasn't prepared for. The girl, the royal palace, and the secrets hidden within its walls. Everything had changed. He had started out simply doing his job, following orders, but now the guard was involved in something far beyond his understanding, and with each passing day, the weight of his responsibilities grew heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into a web of power struggles, a game that was more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. He had always thought of the palace as a place of order and safety, but now it felt like a place of hidden danger. There were whispers in the halls, strange encounters that made him question the loyalty of those around him. And the girl's warning still echoed in his mind. "You're not the only one who's been watching. Be careful." The guard knew that he had to do something. He couldn't sit back and wait for the storm to come. He had already made one mistake, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. It was clear that the situation was growing more dangerous, and he needed to take action before it was too late. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He had to be smart, patient, and most importantly, he had to trust the right people. Late one night, as the palace slept under the quiet of the moon, the guard made his decision. He couldn't trust everyone in the palace, but there were still those he knew had his back. He decided to speak to Lady Ilara again, hoping she could shed light on the growing mystery. She had seemed to know more than she had let on, and perhaps together they could uncover the truth. He found her in one of the palace's quieter rooms, surrounded by books and papers. The faint glow of candlelight illuminated her face, and her eyes seemed tired but determined. When she saw the guard enter, she nodded, as if expecting him. "I knew you would come," she said quietly. "Things are moving faster than we anticipated. The danger is closer than ever." The guard sat down across from her, his mind racing. What's happening? Who else is involved? And what's really going on with the girl? I need to know everything. Lady Ilara sighed, her eyes flickering with a mix of worry and resolve. There are factions within the kingdom, old rivalries that run deep. Not everyone in the royal family is on the same side, and the girl is caught in the middle of it. Her family's history is tangled with those who want to use her as a pawn in a much larger game. The guard listened carefully, trying to piece together the puzzle. "So she's not just a victim in all of this?" "No," Lady Ilara replied, shaking her head. "She has power, more than you realize. Her family holds knowledge that could change the future of the kingdom. But it's dangerous. Very few people know the full story, and even fewer can be trusted." The guard's heart raced. The girl, the one he had seen crying and frightened, was not just a helpless child. She was the key to something much bigger. He had underestimated her, and now he understood how much was at stake. "But if her enemies are already so close," the guard said, "what can we do? How do we protect her?" Lady Ilara looked at him with a steady gaze. "We have to be careful. Moving too quickly could expose her to even greater risk. But we can't wait either. We need to find the truth, and we need to do it before it's too late." The guard nodded. He knew she was right. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and there was no time to waste. He stood up, ready to take action. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let anything happen to her." Lady Ilara smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I know you won't, But remember, you're not just protecting her anymore. You're protecting the future of the kingdom itself. With that, the guard left the room, his mind focused on the task ahead. The path was uncertain, and the dangers were real, but he couldn't back down now. He had already made his choice, and there was no turning back. As he walked through the darkened halls of the palace, he realized that his role had changed. He was no longer just a guard. He was part of something much bigger, a fight for the future of the kingdom, a fight that would test everything he knew. The girl, her family, and the truth they held were now at the center of his world. And the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready. He had to be. There was too much at stake to fail. The guard knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The palace, once a place of routine and order, had become a battlefield. But he was ready to face whatever came next. He would uncover the truth, protect the girl, and keep the kingdom safe, no matter the cost.